The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the land office, and Julia Preston stepped down onto the dusty street of Watsonville, California, clutching a worn leather satchel that contained every document proving she had the legal right to be here, to claim something for herself, to finally stop running from a past that had taken everything else away. The year was 1883, and the small coastal town nestled in the Pajaro Valley seemed like the end of the world to most people. But to Julia, it represented the beginning of everything she had been denied for 24 years. She smoothed her travel-stained skirts and looked down the main street, taking in the wooden storefronts, the saloon with its painted sign, the general store with barrels of goods lined up outside. Men in dusty work clothes eyed her with curiosity as she stood there, a woman alone without a husband or father in sight. She lifted her chin and walked toward the land office, her boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk. Inside, the office smelled of paper and ink and tobacco smoke. A clerk sat behind a desk piled high with maps and ledgers, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up when she entered and immediately frowned. "Help you, miss?" His tone suggested he doubted there was anything he could do for someone like her. "I am here to file a homestead claim," Julia said, keeping her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I have traveled from Missouri to claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act." The clerk set down his pen and leaned back in his chair with a condescending smile. "Miss, the Homestead Act requires that the claimant be the head of a household. That generally means a man or a widow with children. You look a bit young to be a widow, and I do not see any children with you." Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to be dismissed. "The Act states that any adult citizen who is the head of a family may file a claim. I am 24 years old, which makes me an adult. I am unmarried, which makes me the head of my own household, small though it may be. I have every legal right to file this claim." "Now see here," the clerk began, his face reddening. "The lady is correct," a deep voice said from behind Julia. She turned to find a tall man standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. He wore the practical clothing of a working cattleman, dusty trousers, a worn shirt, and a leather vest. His face was tanned from long hours under the California sun, and his eyes, the color of the sky just before a storm, held a quiet intelligence that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that needed a trim, and stepped into the office. "Fletcher James," he said, nodding to Julia before turning his attention to the clerk. "And she is right, Samuel. A single woman can file a homestead claim if she meets the requirements." "I have seen it done before." The clerk, Samuel, scowled but pulled out a fresh form. "Where are you looking to file, miss?" Julia opened her satchel and pulled out a carefully folded map. She had studied the survey maps for weeks before leaving Missouri, identifying parcels that had not yet been claimed. "This section here, along Corralitos Creek. According to the records I obtained from the General Land Office, it has not been claimed." Fletcher James moved closer to look at the map, and Julia caught the scent of leather and sage and honest sweat. "That is good land," he said quietly. "Water access, some timber, decent soil for crops. You have done your research." "I had to," Julia said, meeting his eyes. "This is not a decision I made lightly." Fletcher studied her for a long moment, and Julia had the strange sensation that he was seeing past the travel-worn dress and the determined expression to something deeper. Then he turned to Samuel. "I can ride out with her to verify the boundaries and witness the filing. That should satisfy any concerns about proper procedure." Samuel grumbled, but began filling out the paperwork. "You will need to build a habitable dwelling and cultivate the land. 5 years of residence required before you can prove up and receive the deed." You understand that, miss? I understand perfectly, Julia said. An hour later, Julia stood outside the land office with the first page of her claim filed, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. She had done it. The first step was complete, but now the real work began. You have a place to stay while you get started, Fletcher asked, still standing beside her on the boardwalk. Julia hesitated. I plan to camp on my claim. I have a tent and supplies. Fletcher shook his head. Not alone, you will not. There are drifters and worse in these parts. You need to be practical. I have been practical my entire life, Julia said, an edge creeping into her voice. I appreciate your help in there, Mr. James, but I can take care of myself. I am sure you can, Fletcher said, his tone mild. But practical also means recognizing when you need help. There is a boarding house run by Mrs. Chen on the next street. Clean rooms, decent food, safe. Get yourself settled there while you figure out your next steps. You cannot build a house in a day. Julia wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She had enough money for a few weeks of room and board if she was careful. Thank you for the recommendation. Fletcher nodded and put his hat back on. I run cattle on the ranch north of town, the Circle J. If you need help getting started on your claim, marking boundaries, that sort of thing, you can find me there. No charge, he added quickly when he saw her expression. Just being neighborly. Before Julia could respond, he had tipped his hat and walked away, his long stride carrying him down the street toward where a sturdy bay horse stood tied to a hitching post. Julia watched him go, puzzled by the unexpected kindness from a stranger. The boarding house was exactly as Fletcher had described, a well-maintained building with a neat garden in front. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile, showed Julia to a small room on the second floor. It was simple but clean, with a bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. You are the woman filing a homestead claim, Mrs. Chen said, not a question but a statement. Word travels fast in a small town. You have courage. Or foolishness, Julia said, setting down her satchel. I am not certain which yet. Perhaps both, Mrs. Chen said with a slight smile. But courage and foolishness often look the same at the beginning. It is only later that we know which it was. Supper is at 6. You look like you could use a good meal. That evening, Julia sat in the boarding house dining room with 5 other residents, all men who worked in the area as farmhands or mill workers. They were curious about her but respectful, and Mrs. Chen ruled the table with quiet authority that prevented any rudeness. The food was simple but plentiful, beef stew and fresh bread and vegetables from the garden. After supper, Julia returned to her room and spread out her map and her carefully saved money. She had enough to buy basic supplies, lumber for a small cabin, seeds for a garden. But she would need to work quickly. The law required improvements within 6 months, and she had to establish residence. Every penny would count. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind racing with plans and worries and the memory of Fletcher James's storm-colored eyes. The next morning, Julia woke before dawn and dressed in her most practical clothing, a split skirt designed for riding and a sturdy blouse. She had learned to ride as a girl, before her father died and her world fell apart, and she had purchased a horse and basic tack in San Francisco before making the journey to Watsonville. The mare was stabled at the livery. A calm, dun-colored horse the dealer had promised, was steady and reliable. Julia walked to the livery in the early morning light, the air fresh and cool, smelling of the ocean that lay just a few miles to the west. The stable hand helped her saddle the mare, which she had named Daisy, and she rode out toward her claim with her map and a canteen of water. Corralitos Creek wound through the valley, its banks lined with sycamore and willow trees. Julia followed the landmarks on her map, counting off the section markers until she reached the parcel that was now, legally, hers to prove up. 160 acres of California land that no one could take away from her if she met the requirements. She dismounted and walked the property, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and overwhelming responsibility. The land rolled gently, with a mix of open meadow and oak woodland. The creek formed the eastern boundary, guaranteeing water year-round. She could see where she would build her cabin, on a slight rise with a view of the valley and protection from the wind. Julia was standing there, trying to imagine the house and the garden and the future she would build, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She turned to see Fletcher James riding toward her on the same bay horse from the day before. He reined in and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning. Thought I would find you out here. Have you come to tell me more reasons why this is difficult?" Julia asked, not unkindly. Fletcher smiled, a slow transformation of his serious face that made him look younger. "No. I came to help you mark your corners so there is no dispute later about boundaries, and to bring you this." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Mrs. Chen sent breakfast, said you left without eating." Julia felt an unexpected warmth at the thoughtfulness. That was kind of her, and of you. They spent the morning riding the boundaries of the claim, Fletcher showing Julia how to read the survey markers and explaining the importance of establishing clear corners. He had brought wooden stakes and they drove them into the ground at each corner, Fletcher wielding the hammer with easy strength. "How long have you been ranching here?" Julia asked as they worked. 5 years, Fletcher said. "Came out from Texas after the war. My father fought for the Confederacy and never recovered from the loss. When he died, I sold what little we had and came west looking for a fresh start. Built the Circle J from nothing. So you understand what I am trying to do," Julia said. Fletcher looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded slowly. "I do. But I had the advantage of being a man. No one questioned my right to be here to claim land to build something. You are going to face opposition at every turn just because of your gender. That is not right, but it is reality." "Which is exactly why I have to succeed," Julia said quietly. "I need to prove it can be done." They ate the breakfast Mrs. Chen had packed, sitting in the shade of an oak tree, sharing bread and cheese and apples. Fletcher asked careful questions about where she had come from and why, and Julia found herself telling him more than she had intended. "My father died when I was 16, she said, staring out at the creek. "He had debts I did not know about. The bank took our farm. My mother and I went to live with her brother, my uncle. He was not a kind man. When my mother died 2 years later, he expected me to stay on as an unpaid servant, cooking and cleaning for him and his sons. I stayed until I turned 21 because I had nowhere else to go. Then I left with the small amount my mother had hidden away for me. I worked for 3 years, saving every penny. I was a seamstress, a cook, a laundress, anything that would pay. I was determined to have something of my own, something no man could take from me because I had not earned it myself." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. "Your uncle, he did not try to stop you." "He did," Julia said. "He claimed I owed him for his charity in housing me. I left in the night with just my savings and the clothes I could carry. I have not looked back. And you chose California. I chose land that was available and a climate that would allow me to grow crops year-round if I am careful. I chose a place far enough from Missouri that my uncle would never bother to follow. I chose freedom, Mr. James." "Fletcher," he said, "if we are going to be neighbors, and if I am going to help you build your cabin, you should call me Fletcher." Julia felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with nerves about the claim. "Then you should call me Julia." Over the following weeks, Fletcher became a constant presence as Julia worked to establish her homestead. He helped her hire a wagon to haul lumber from the mill, and he showed up with tools and his own labor to help her build a cabin. Julia insisted on paying him, but he refused money, saying only that neighbors helped neighbors and she could return the favor someday. The cabin took shape slowly, a simple one-room structure with a loft for sleeping and a stone fireplace Fletcher built with impressive skill. Julia worked alongside him, learning how to notch logs and split shingles and mix mortar. Her hands blistered and her muscles ached, but she had never felt more alive. They talked as they worked, long conversations about everything and nothing. Fletcher told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the complicated legacy of a war that had torn his family apart. Julia shared her dreams of a productive farm, a garden that would feed her and provide surplus to sell, maybe chickens and a milk cow eventually. "You have thought this through," Fletcher said one afternoon as they took a break from raising the roof beams. He handed her a canteen and she drank gratefully, the water cool and sweet. "I have had years to think about it," Julia said. "Every night when I was living under my uncle's roof, I would lie in bed and imagine this. My own land, my own home, freedom to make my own choices." Fletcher looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are the most determined person I have ever met, Julia Preston." "I have to be," she said. "The world does not make space for women like me. We have to carve it out ourselves." As the days passed, Julia became aware that her feelings for Fletcher were deepening into something beyond gratitude. She noticed the way he moved, efficient and graceful despite his size. She noticed how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and how patient he was when teaching her new skills. She noticed how safe she felt when he was near, and how much she looked forward to seeing him each day. But she pushed those feelings down, unwilling to risk the friendship and help he offered. She was here to build a life on her own terms, not to become dependent on a man, no matter how kind or handsome he might be. The cabin was completed in mid-July, just as summer heat settled over the valley. Fletcher helped Julia move her few possessions from the boarding house, and Mrs. Chen sent along a basket of food and a quilt as a housewarming gift. "You will come back to town for supplies and company," Mrs. Chen said, her tone making it clear it was not a question. "Do not become a hermit out there." "I promise," Julia said, touched by the older woman's concern. That first night in her own cabin, Julia lay in the loft and looked up at the rough ceiling beams she had helped raise, listening to the sounds of the creek and the wind in the trees. She had done it. She had built a home with her own hands on land that was legally hers. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief and joy and fierce pride. The next challenge was getting crops in the ground, even though it was late in the season. Fletcher brought seeds from his own stores, vegetables that might still have time to mature before winter. Julia cleared land for a garden, breaking the soil with a borrowed plow pulled by Daisy, who proved to be as steady as promised. Fletcher showed up one morning with another horse, a big draft animal named Duke. "Daisy is a good mare, but she is not meant for heavy work. Use Duke for the plowing. You can return him when you are done or keep him if you find him useful. I have others." Julia wanted to refuse, uncomfortable with accepting so much help, but she was also practical enough to recognize that she needed the animal. "I will return him when I can afford my own draft horse, and I will pay you for his use." "His use costs you nothing but making sure he has water and decent grazing," Fletcher said firmly. "Julia, accepting help is not weakness. It is good sense." She planted beans and squash and late corn, carrots and potatoes that might have time to develop before the first frost. She built a chicken coop from scrap lumber and bought 6 hens from a farm down the valley. Every day brought new challenges and new small victories. Fletcher continued to visit regularly, always with some excuse like checking on Duke or bringing news from town. Julia looked forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit. They would sit on the porch of her cabin in the evening and watch the sun set over the coastal hills, talking about everything under the sky. One evening in late August, as they sat together in comfortable silence, Fletcher said quietly, "I need to tell you something, Julia." She turned to look at him, alarmed by the serious tone. "What is it?" He took a breath. "I have been helping you because you needed help and because it was the right thing to do. But that is not the only reason anymore. I have come to care for you, Julia. More than I should, probably, given that you have made it clear you are here to build an independent life." But I could not continue without being honest about my feelings. Julia's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Fletcher, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I am not asking for anything from you, I just needed you to know. It would not have been honest to keep pretending my interest was purely neighborly." Julia stood and walked to the edge of the porch, her mind spinning. She had been so focused on not becoming dependent, on proving she could make it alone, that she had not let herself fully acknowledge what she felt for this man who had become essential to her days. "When I left Missouri," she said slowly, not looking at him, "I swore I would never let myself become the kind of woman who needed a man to survive. I watched my mother lose everything when my father died. I watched her become small and frightened and dependent on her brother's charity. I promised myself I would be different." "You are different," Fletcher said, standing but keeping his distance. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Julia. Caring for someone does not make you weak or dependent. It just makes you human." She turned to face him. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I am afraid that if I let myself love you, I will lose myself, that I will become what society expects, a wife whose identity disappears into her husband's shadow." Fletcher crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her hands in his. "I would never ask that of you. This land, this claim, it would stay yours. Your dreams would stay yours. I am not looking for a woman to cook and clean and exist in my shadow, Julia. I am looking for a partner, someone strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me." Julia looked up into his face, seeing the honesty in his storm-colored eyes, and felt something break open inside her chest. "I care for you too," she whispered. "I have been fighting it because I was afraid, but I care for you, Fletcher James." He smiled, that slow transformation that made her heart skip. "Then maybe we can figure this out together. No rush, no expectations, just honest about what we feel and what we want." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, and Julia felt a warmth spread through her entire body. This was different from anything she had imagined. This was not about needing a man or becoming dependent. This was about 2 people choosing each other as equals. As summer faded into autumn, Julia and Fletcher's relationship deepened. He continued to maintain his own ranch while helping her with the heavier work on her claim. She insisted on reciprocating, riding to the Circle J to help with tasks like mending fences and sorting cattle. They were building something together while maintaining their separate identities and properties. The garden produced a modest but valuable harvest, and Julia carefully preserved everything she could, learning from Mrs. Chen how to can vegetables and dry herbs. Her chickens laid eggs that she traded in town for supplies. She was making it work, proving that a woman alone could successfully homestead. But she was not entirely alone anymore, and that no longer frightened her the way it once had. In October, Fletcher asked Julia to accompany him to a barn dance in town. "It is time people saw us together," he said. "Time they knew I am courting you if you are comfortable with that." Julia felt a flutter of nerves. There will be talk. Questions about whether my claim is legitimate if I have a man helping me. Let them talk, Fletcher said. You filed that claim on your own. You built this cabin and planted this garden and made improvements to the land. My help does not diminish what you have accomplished. And anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me. The dance was held in a large barn decorated with lanterns and fall leaves. Half the county seemed to be there, families and farmhands and merchants from town. Julia wore her best dress, a deep blue that matched Fletcher's eyes, and he cleaned up remarkably well in a pressed shirt and vest. They danced together, Fletcher's hand warm and steady on her waist as they moved through a simple waltz. Julia was aware of eyes watching them, of whispered conversations, but Fletcher's attention never wavered from her. During a break in the music, they stepped outside for fresh air. The night was cool and clear, stars brilliant overhead. Fletcher took Julia's hand and led her away from the barn to a quieter spot under an oak tree. I have been thinking, he said, his voice low and serious, about the future, about what I want and what you want and how those things might fit together. Julia's heart began to race. What have you been thinking? I want to marry you, Julia, Fletcher said, turning to face her directly. But not in the way marriages usually work. I want us to be partners in every sense. Your claim stays yours. You prove it up and get your deed. My ranch stays mine. We build our lives side by side, not one absorbed into the other. Is that something you could want? Julia felt tears prick her eyes. You would do that. You would marry me, but let me keep my independence. It is not about letting you, Fletcher said gently. You own that independence. I am just asking to share my life with you while respecting what you have built for yourself. I love you, Julia. Not some version of you that fits into a traditional role, but exactly who you are right now. Determined and strong and uncompromising in the best possible way. I love you too, Julia said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. I think I have loved you since the day you walked into that land office and stood up for my right to file that claim. You have never once made me feel like I needed to be less than I am. Fletcher pulled her into his arms and kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper, and Julia felt the last of her walls crumble. This was what she had been afraid to hope for, a love that did not require her to diminish herself, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared strength. They were married in November in a simple ceremony at the church in Watsonville, with Mrs. Chen and several ranchers from the valley standing as witnesses. Julia wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric the color of cream, and Fletcher wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. But the most important part was the conversation they had with the minister beforehand, making clear that Julia's property would remain hers, that she would continue to prove up her claim in her own name, and that their marriage was a partnership of equals. The minister had been skeptical, but agreed when Fletcher made it clear he would find another officiant if necessary. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the boarding house, Mrs. Chen having prepared a feast that drew half the town. Julia stood beside Fletcher and felt, for the first time in her life, completely at peace. She had not given up her independence. She had expanded it to include someone who valued her for exactly who she was. They divided their time between Julia's cabin and Fletcher's ranch house, both properties continuing to operate independently. Julia continued to work her claim, expanding her garden and adding a small orchard of fruit trees. Fletcher helped when she needed heavy labor, but she made all the decisions about her land and her crops. In return, Julia became an equal partner in ranch operations. She had a good eye for cattle and proved to be skilled at managing the books, something Fletcher had always struggled with. Together, they made both properties more productive and profitable. Winter came gently to the coastal valley, bringing rain but not the harsh cold Julia had known in Missouri. She and Fletcher spent long evenings by the fireplace in one home or the other, making plans for the coming year, reading to each other from books they ordered from San Francisco, simply enjoying the quiet comfort of shared space. On Christmas morning, Fletcher gave Julia a deed of partnership in the Circle J Ranch. "You have made this place better," he said as she stared at the legal document in shock. "You should own part of it officially. We are partners in everything else. This should be no different." Julia's gift to him was a ledger showing that her claim was officially approved for proving up, the required improvements documented and accepted by the land office. "3.5 more years and I will have my deed," she said. "But I could not have gotten this far without you." "You could have," Fletcher said, pulling her close. "It would have been harder and taken longer, but you would have found a way. That is who you are. Spring brought new challenges and new joys." Julia discovered she was pregnant in March, and the news filled her with a complicated mixture of happiness and fear. She worried about how a child would change her ability to work her claim, to maintain her independence. Fletcher sensed her anxiety and took her hands one evening as they sat on the porch of her cabin watching the sunset. "Nothing has to change," he said. "We will figure it out together. Your claim is nearly proved up. One child will not stop you from finishing what you started." "I do not want to become just a mother," Julia said quietly. "I want to be that too, but not only that." "You will be Julia Preston James," Fletcher said firmly. "Homesteader, rancher, mother, wife, and whatever else you decide to be, having a child is adding to your life, not replacing it." The baby was born in late October, delivered by Mrs. Chen with Fletcher pacing anxiously outside the cabin. It was a boy, healthy and strong-lunged, and they named him Thomas after Julia's father. Julia recovered quickly from the birth, driven by the knowledge that she still had work to do to prove up her claim. With Thomas strapped to her back in a sling Mrs. Chen showed her how to make, she continued to tend her garden and her chickens, to make improvements to her property. Fletcher was a devoted father, taking Thomas for hours at a time so Julia could work, never suggesting that she should focus solely on motherhood. He had meant what he said about partnership, and he proved it every day in both large gestures and small ones. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work and love. Julia proved up her claim in 1888, receiving her deed to 160 acres in her own name. She cried when the clerk handed her the official document, Fletcher standing beside her with Thomas on his hip. "You did it," Fletcher said quietly. "Everything you came here for." "I did more than that," Julia said, looking at her husband and son. "I found things I did not even know I was looking for." They expanded both properties over the years, Julia's homestead focusing on produce and orchards, while the Circle J remained primarily cattle. They sold beef and vegetables to the growing towns of the valley, and they built a reputation for quality and fair dealing. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who loved both properties equally, learning to ride and rope from his father and to garden and preserve food from his mother. Julia was determined that her son would see women as capable and strong, that he would grow up understanding that partnership meant equality. In 1892, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. Fletcher had hoped for a girl, saying he wanted a little version of Julia, and he was not disappointed. Grace proved to have her mother's determination and her father's patience, a combination that promised interesting things for her future. The homestead cabin was expanded over the years, growing from one room to a proper house with multiple bedrooms and a real kitchen. But Julia kept the original room intact, the space where she had spent her first night on land no one could take away from her. It became a library and sitting room, lined with books, and filled with comfortable chairs. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Fletcher and Julia stood on the porch of that original cabin and looked out over the land they had built together. Thomas, now 9, was helping with the cattle at the Circle J. Grace, just 3, was napping inside under Mrs. Chen's watchful eye, the older woman having become honorary grandmother to the children. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked. "Coming west, filing that claim, all the hard work it took." Julia leaned against him, fitting perfectly under his arm. "Not for a single moment. I came here seeking land no one could take away, and I found that. But I also found something I had not known to seek. I found a partner who helped me file that claim and then helped me build a life beyond anything I had imagined. I just pointed you toward the right forms," Fletcher said with a smile. "You did so much more than that," Julia said seriously. "You saw me as an equal when most men would not have. You respected my dreams even when they did not fit traditional expectations. You helped me build a life that was mine while building one with me. That is worth more than any deed or any amount of land." Fletcher kissed the top of her head. "I am the one who benefited from this partnership. You made me better, Julia. You challenged me to see beyond what I had been taught about how things should be. You showed me that true strength is supporting someone to be fully themselves." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the coastal hills in shades of gold and orange. In the distance, they could hear Thomas laughing at something, the sound carrying on the evening breeze. "We should think about teaching the children to file their own claims someday," Julia said thoughtfully. "Both of them, Thomas and Grace equally. They should each have land of their own, something no one can take away." "Agreed," Fletcher said. "Though something tells me Grace will be the one filing first. She has your determination." Julia laughed. "She has your stubbornness too, a formidable combination." As the years continued to unfold, the James family became a fixture in the growing community. Julia served on the school board, fighting for equal education for girls. Fletcher worked with other ranchers to establish fair practices and decent wages for workers. Together, they modeled a different kind of marriage, one built on respect and equality. Thomas grew into a young man who treated women with respect, having been raised by parents who demonstrated partnership daily. Grace proved to be exactly as determined as her mother predicted, declaring at age 12 that she would homestead her own claim when she was old enough. In 1903, when Julia was 44 and Fletcher 47, they stood in the land office in Watsonville with Grace, now 14, as she studied the maps of available parcels with the same intensity her mother had shown 20 years earlier. The clerk, a younger man than the one who had tried to dismiss Julia back in 1883, treated Grace with respect. "Your daughter has a good eye for land," he said to Julia. "She comes by it honestly," Julia said with pride. That evening, the extended family gathered at the original homestead cabin for Sunday supper, a tradition they had maintained for years. Thomas was there with the young woman he was courting, a schoolteacher named Anne who could match Grace in determination. Mrs. Chen, now elderly but still sharp as ever, presided over the table. As they ate the food that came from Julia's garden and Fletcher's cattle, as they laughed and talked and made plans for the future, Julia felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had come west seeking land no one could take away, driven by fear and loss and a desperate need for independence. What she had found was so much more. She had found a home and a partner and a family. She had found community and purpose. She had found that true independence was not about refusing all help or connection, but about choosing relationships that honored who she was. Fletcher caught her eye across the table and smiled. That slow transformation she had fallen in love with 2 decades earlier. He raised his glass in a small toast just for her, and she raised hers in return. After supper, as the others cleaned up and the younger people gathered on the porch, Julia and Fletcher walked down to Corralito's Creek, following the path they had walked countless times over the years. The water flowed steady and clear, just as it had the first day Julia had stood on this land and imagined her future. "You remember the day we marked the boundaries?" Fletcher asked, taking her hand. "I remember thinking you were kind, but that I should not depend on that kindness," Julia said. "I was so determined to do everything alone." "You did do it," Fletcher said. "You filed that claim on your own. You proved it up. Everything you wanted to accomplish, you accomplished." "But I did not have to do it alone," Julia said. "That was what I learned. That accepting help and building partnerships does not diminish what we achieve. It enhances it." They stood by the creek as the last light faded from the sky, two people who had built something lasting together. Julia thought about the young woman she had been, stepping off that stagecoach with nothing but determination and documents. That woman had been brave and strong, but she had also been afraid and alone. The woman she had become was braver and stronger, not despite the love and partnership she had found, but because of it. Fletcher had helped her file that claim all those years ago, but more than that, he had helped her claim a life that was richer and fuller than she had known to dream of. In the years that followed, Julia and Fletcher watched their children grow and build their own lives. Grace did indeed file her own homestead claim when she turned 21, choosing land in the next valley over. She proved it up successfully, becoming one of the first women in the county to do so without being widowed first. She eventually married a man who respected her independence as much as Fletcher had respected Julia's, and they built their own partnership ranch. Thomas took over management of the Circle J, expanding it with his father's guidance and his mother's business sense. He married Anne, the schoolteacher, and together they established a school on the ranch property that served the children of farm workers and ranchers alike, believing education should be accessible to all. Julia continued to work her original homestead well into her 60s, though she eventually turned over the heavier labor to hired help. The property became known throughout the valley for its orchards, the fruit trees she had planted decades earlier now mature and productive. Fletcher remained active on the Circle J until his health began to fail in his early 70s. Even then, he would ride out each morning to check on the cattle and the land he loved, Julia often riding beside him. On a spring morning in 1918, 35 years after Julia had first stepped off that stagecoach, she and Fletcher sat on the porch of the homestead cabin and watched their grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas and Anne had 3 children. Grace and her husband had 4, and all of them loved spending time at the place they called the original place, the homestead where it had all begun. 7 grandchildren, Fletcher said with wonder. "When I helped you file that claim, I never imagined all this." "What did you imagine?" Julia asked, taking his hand. His fingers were gnarled with age and hard work, but his grip was still strong. "I imagined a stubborn woman building a cabin and proving everyone wrong," Fletcher said with a smile. "I was not wrong about that part. But I could not have imagined how much more there would be, how much life we would build together." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the silence they had shared for so many years. "You helped me file more than a land claim that day," she said quietly. "You helped me claim the possibility of a different kind of life, one where I did not have to choose between independence and love." "We helped each other," Fletcher said. "You taught me what real partnership looks like. You made me better than I would have been alone." As the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, they watched their grandchildren run and play on the land that Julia had claimed, the land that had become the foundation for generations. The oldest grandchild, Thomas's daughter Julia, named after her grandmother, was already talking about filing her own claim someday, carrying on the tradition of strong women who owned their own land. Fletcher passed away peacefully in his sleep in the fall of 1920, at the age of 64. Julia held his hand in those final moments, grateful for every day they had shared, every challenge they had faced together, every dream they had built into reality. She continued to live on the homestead for another 12 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She saw Grace's oldest son file a claim of his own, watched young Julia grow into a fierce advocate for women's suffrage, celebrated as women finally won the right to vote in 1920. On a warm afternoon in June 1932, Julia sat on the porch of the cabin she had built so many years ago and looked out over the land she had claimed. She was 73 years old, and she could feel her strength fading, but she felt no fear, only profound gratitude for the life she had lived. Grace sat beside her, holding her hand. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" "About the day I arrived in Watsonville," Julia said softly. "I was so young and so afraid, though I would not have admitted the fear. I thought I knew exactly what I wanted, land that no one could take away, independence, security. And you got all of that," Grace said. "I got so much more," Julia said. "I got a partner who respected my strength. I got children who taught me that love does not limit us, it expands us. I got a community that became family. I got a life beyond anything I had imagined." "Because Dad helped you file that claim," Grace said. Julia smiled, remembering Fletcher as he had been that day in the land office, standing up for her right to claim her future. "He helped me file the claim, but more than that, he helped me understand that independence and partnership are not opposites, that I could be strong and still accept help, that I could build something of my own and still share my life with someone. That was the greatest gift he gave me." As the afternoon light slanted golden across the valley, Julia closed her eyes and felt the peace of a life fully lived. She had come west seeking land no one could take away, and she had found it. But she had also found love and partnership and a legacy that would extend far beyond her own years. The homestead remained in the family for generations, each inheriting not just the land but the story of the woman who had claimed it and the cowboy who had helped her file the papers. It became a reminder that the best partnerships are built on respect, that true love enhances rather than limits, and that the courage to claim what we need is matched only by the wisdom to accept help when it is freely offered. Julia passed away peacefully that evening, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that she had built something that would last. She had come west alone, seeking independence and land that no one could take away. She had found all of that and more, building a life and a love that proved the greatest claims we make are not on land, but on the possibilities of partnership and the power of respecting each other's dreams. The original homestead cabin still stands today, preserved by the family as a testament to the woman who built it and the man who stood beside her. On the porch, a plaque reads, "Julia Preston James, homesteader. She came west seeking land no one could take away. She found that and so much more." And in the family stories passed down through the generations, they still tell of the determined young woman who stepped off a stagecoach in 1883 and the cowboy who helped her file the claim that changed everything, not just for them, but for all the daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters who learned from their example that strength and partnership, independence and love, are not contradictions but complements, two halves of a whole life fully lived.